As early as March 1942, Chink Dorman Smith had warned Auchinleck in a written report that Eighth Army, with its amateur tactics, widespread desert jargon, and old boy network, was more of a club than a strictly disciplined entity. Auchinleck had ignored this sound assessment. The South African historian J.A.I. Edgar Hamilton certainly had Auchinleck's measure when he wrote that Auchinleck as a commander was hopeless, but not because he was a fool. He possessed, in fact, both a first-class military brain and good fighting spirit. What he lacked was leadership. He never seemed to be able to get anyone to obey him. It was an astute assessment. In confirmation of Edgar Hamilton's last point, Howard Kippenberger confirmed Auchinleck's lack of leadership skills. According to Kippenberger, I myself heard him say, "It is like everything else in this army. If I want a thing done, I have to do it myself." British author and wartime press officer in Cairo, Lawrence Durrell, thought that Auchinleck was absolutely charming. But Durrell also recalled that Auchinleck had no real personality, and as a result, he just could not inspire men to action. To this, Freiberg would add that Auchinleck was one of the finest characters imaginable, but he was stubborn and one of the worst judges of men. Freiberg believed that until the appointments of Montgomery and Alexander in August 1942, the prestige of British generalship was at its lowest possible point. Auchinleck was certainly not helped by his choice of corps commanders, either, which reflected his inability to judge their qualities. The 6-foot former Army boxing champion Strafer Gott, for example, had strong leadership skills, and because of his calm courage in the face of so many crises, he had become an almost legendary figure to the officers and men of the Eighth Army. While Gott was universally admired, he was content to follow his own path rather than implement Auchinleck's orders. Freiberg thought that Gott was a likable man and a brave one, but there was something very wrong with the way he worked. Edgar Hamilton's view was that Auchinleck was continually undermined by Gott. He wrote shortly after the war that the Auk was undoubtedly unlucky in having to deal with one with such outstanding qualities of leadership, a legendary personality, and a complete absence of military sense. This applied to most of Auchinleck's key appointments. Kippenberger thought that the armored commanders were wretched fellows who never read military history and consequently evolved practices contrary to the experience of war. Auchinleck's decision to relieve the reasonably competent Corps Commander Lieutenant General Charles Willoughby Norrie on July 7 and replace him with Major General William Ramsden from 50th Division caused extreme surprise and consternation throughout 8th Army. Kippenberger explained why. The British officers at that period spoke of Ramsden as a notorious bonehead, and he certainly looked like one. Auchinleck never explained why he relieved Norrie of command, but it is probable that he blamed Norrie for much of the Gazala debacle. Norrie was liked and respected by many in 8th Army, and his sacking was just another indicator of the division and friction amongst its higher commanders. In the July battle, Auchinleck was fortunate that the DAF had air superiority over the battlefield. Without this, 8th Army's casualties would have been much higher than they were. Robin Nealons wrote, "In this continual July fighting, much of the credit on the British side must go to the Desert Air Force." It had been the DAF's busiest month of the war to date. During July, its squadrons had flown more than 15,000 sorties, which was an average of over 500 attacks a day. In the summer months of 1942, 8th Army had incurred a staggering 80,000 casualties. In July 1942, it had suffered more than 13,000 casualties during this first battle of El Alamein. Most of these were experienced by the infantry divisions doing the hard fighting. The 2nd New Zealand Division had suffered just over 4,000 casualties. The Australian 9th Division, 2,552, and the 5th Indian Division, some 3,000. Neil Barr wrote a summary of Operation Splendor, which is apt for the First Alamein battle. Barr wrote, "The soldiers of 8th Army had once again displayed courage and determination, but had been let down by faulty tactics, poor planning, and a fundamental failure of command. The constant activity and heavy losses resulting from the poorly planned and ill-coordinated operations had brought 8th Army close to exhaustion." There was overwhelming evidence to suggest that 8th Army suffered a morale crisis in the summer of 1942, and that it severely affected 8th Army's performance. This was caused by the effects of both the Gazala battle and First Alamein. Gazala was a serious defeat with heavy casualties. First Alamein was a victory, but casualties had been needlessly excessive, and attempts to drive Panzer Army off key features in late July had also failed. The crisis of morale was evident in the incidence of NYDN, not yet diagnosed nervous, or battle exhaustion, which was disturbingly high. Also disturbingly high were all the other indicators of low morale: sickness, desertion, absenteeism, and surrender. This morale crisis can be directly attributed to Eighth Army's leadership. Auchinleck was aware of how serious the morale and discipline problem had become. His solution was to request the British War Office to reinstate the death penalty for desertion in the field and for misbehaving in the face of the enemy in such a manner as to show cowardice. Desertion and cowardice had been military crimes punishable by death during the First World War, but capital punishment for such offenses had been abolished in 1930. That Auchinleck now wanted it reinstated as a salutary deterrent was an indication of his poor leadership skills. Rather than relying on his personal and expert powers, Auchinleck was forced to turn to policies of coercion to maintain his troops' willingness and discipline to fight. Auchinleck's request also indicates how little he understood the men he was commanding. The reintroduction of the death penalty for desertion and cowardice would have further eroded the Army's fragile morale. Its implementation would have had dire consequences, too. One of New Zealand's most respected and able military commanders made this clear after the war. Howard Kippenberger wrote to a friend in 1949 that he was very distressed to learn that the death penalty was being considered for desertion and cowardice in Eighth Army. Kippenberger wrote, "I don't know what justification there is for execution for cowardice. There were 4 men executed in 1st NZEF. We had, of course, no death penalty, and I think if men belonging to the 2nd New Zealand Division had been executed, the morale of the whole show would have been ruined." Kippenberger was certainly correct in his assessment. The crisis in Eighth Army's morale and the request to reinstate the death penalty were clear evidence that Auchinleck was failing in his task of commanding Eighth Army. He could not provide the leadership it needed to win a decisive battle. It was certainly apparent to those at the sharp end of the fighting in the Western Desert that there was a crisis of confidence in Eighth Army. Fortunately for the soldiers and junior commanders of the Army, the political and military authorities in London also had grave concerns with how Eighth Army was being used. Some new brooms were being readied for use. Chapter 3. Drastic and Immediate Changes. Waging war in the Egyptian desert was never easy, but campaigning during the peak of summer in July and August was a torment for those who were forced to do it. The fierce sun beat down from a cloudless sky at a location where no natural shade was to be found. This was a land well suited for war. There were no farms or crops to ruin, no cities or towns to pound to rubble. One British soldier-poet expressed the landscape succinctly. This land was made for war. As glass resists the bite of vitriol, so this hard and calcined earth rejects the battle's hot, corrosive impact.